Hi everyone. Hope you had a good week last week, good weekend, and just want to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that we went over last week. Not a lot to go over when we're doing our medical terminology, but just did want to talk a little bit about kind of the importance of circulatory system, respiratory system, GI system, all really important areas for us to understand, especially if you were to go to work in the hospital setting. Circulatory, GI, probably the two biggest areas from an outpatient perspective. If you were to work in the hospital setting, from a procedural perspective, a lot of outpatient procedures that are GI and circulatory. Lots of you think about cardiac catheterizations, lots of endoscopies, all in that GI and cardiovascular area. So really important that we understand the terminology in those areas. And circulatory, I think I'd even mentioned this last week, circulatory can get really confusing. So super important that we can have an understanding of some of the information in that area. So important week, and it's just from a health literacy standpoint, it's nice to understand a lot of that information, even if we're not going into a clinical area. I know that some of you are interested in clinical areas, but even if we're not interested in clinical, I am a non-clinical person completely, but it's really important for me. It was always very important for me from an administrative standpoint to understand that terminology, be able to look at a medical record and speak the same language as the providers. Gave me more credibility. So the other thing I wanted to make sure, hopefully you took a look at the healthcare terminology glossary that was in last week's reading, and this is just a small assortment of some of the terminology that you'll see. And what's interesting about healthcare terminology in general is the number of acronyms that are used. And in some instances, they've listed acronyms like right on the first page here. You'll see activities of daily living, ADLs, and you'll often see it referred to as ADLs on a medical record. And these are the kinds of things that, let's say we have a patient that maybe had a stroke or had some kind of traumatic brain injury, or had some maybe is suffering from dementia, or has some kind of deficit that is affecting their ability to dress or bathe or cook for themselves. And so these types of things, dressing, bathing, just the normal types of things that we take for granted often for ourselves, these are activities of daily living. So that's what they're referred to, and you'll often see them in a medical record as ADLs. So important to know those types of acronyms. Throughout the document, you'll see a lot of these acronyms, and unfortunately, this industry, the healthcare industry, is rife with acronyms, and oftentimes acronyms are not universal. So you'll see one person use an acronym for one thing, and then that same acronym will mean something else in another place. And one thing that a lot of hospitals will do is they will have a specific policy that defines their abbreviations. So this hospital will say, here is our defined set of abbreviations for our medical record, and you can only use these abbreviations in our medical record. And that really helps to make clear what certain things mean in that medical record, and it can really help to avoid situations of confusion. The key to those situations using that defined abbreviation set is making sure that they get buy-in from all the providers, and making sure that all the providers are using those defined abbreviations, especially now that in the past when a lot of physicians and other providers dictated their notes. It was just a matter of making sure that if there was an abbreviation that perhaps was not the norm, it would be clarified, queried to the provider, and then corrected in the record by, say, the transcriptionist, as opposed to now when in many cases, maybe dragon speak is used, so it's automatically going into the record from a from a computerized perspective, or physicians are actually responsible for typing directly into the medical record through an electronic health record system. So they are responsible for using the correct abbreviations. So as long as there's buy-in, that's great. But in some instances, if there's not buy-in into those correct abbreviations, there can be some confusion in the end if they're not using all of the correct abbreviations. There are some, and I think I've mentioned this in the discussion boards, there are some discussions around what's called a standardized terminology, one of which was called SNOMED, which is, and you would think that we have standardized terminology, but we really don't. What certain conditions or symptoms and whatnot are called across the country can really vary, which is interesting. It's a lot of things are geographically, conditions and issues are really geographically defined, and so what is helpful, especially in electronic medical records, electronic health records, as they start talking to one another across the country, which is our hope eventually, to have a standardized terminology, so that if I have a condition in Pittsburgh and I have a condition in New York and I have a condition in Los Angeles, that same condition will be called the exact same thing across the country. And you'd be surprised how different things are called by different providers. Obviously, if someone has breast cancer, it's likely going to be breast cancer. But symptoms and there are some geographic variations in what some folks call certain things. So there is some standardization of terminology, and this one standardized terminology is called SNOMED, and they've been pushing for this probably since I got into the industry, maybe slightly after, maybe the past 15 years or so. It hasn't gone very far, unfortunately, because it is something different than what providers have learned. So the way we really do standardize our terminology is through diagnosis coding, and that really does standardize things across the board. So for this week, what we're going to be doing, which is a little different than what we've done in our other medical terminology weeks, we do have a blog this week. I just wanted to remind everybody of that. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the most interesting concept that you found in the reading over the past weeks in medical terminology. So it could be a word fragment, it could be a disease that you hadn't heard of, a part of the body that you'd never really known much about, anything that you just found really interesting, a concept that you'd found really interesting. So shared one of our blog posts like we've been doing at the beginning of the course, just share one of those blog posts with us this week. So that's all I've got to say. I can't believe it's week 7. This term has flown by. Terms fly by so quickly when they're only 8 weeks long. But so I hope everyone is getting ready for their holiday break. It'll be nice to have a couple of weeks of a break, especially for those of you that are online students, fully online students. We don't get a break except for this couple of weeks each year. So I hope that you enjoy your break, and but we do have a little bit of work to go, so keep pushing hard until the end of the term, and we'll see you all on the discussion boards. Thanks so much.